the term insulin resistance, it makes it sound like it's only related to diabetes, but in reality, it's sort of a central, influential figure that touches almost every single chronic disease you can think of. And if you can just sort of eat to reverse that and get rid of insulin resistance in your body, then you lower your overall chronic disease risk, and you get a lot of bang for your buck.
Hi, it's James here from Food Matters, and today I'm going to be speaking with two incredible guests, Robbie Barbaro and Cyrus Khambatta. And we are going to be talking about diabetes and managing insulin resistance and balancing blood sugar levels. And this is a topic that affects everybody because how we regulate blood sugar can impact us in a myriad of ways, from weight management to mood and energy control and mastery, but also, of course, weight gain and diabetes type 1 and type 2. And this is an issue that affects so many millions of people around the world. And these two gentlemen today have had a personal experience living with diabetes, the both of them. They've studied nutritional biochemistry and public health, and they have written a book called Mastering Diabetes. They're the co-founder of Mastering Diabetes as well, the both of them, Robbie and Cyrus together. And we're going to be talking about everything sugar, diabetes, weight gain, energy management, and the like today. Cyrus, Robbie, how are you guys?
Doing great. Thanks so much for having us here today, James.
Really excited for this.
So this is my sort of first three-way interview, so I'm excited about that as well, and thankful to the technology for this. So maybe, Cyrus, do you want to kick off, seeing your top right on my screen here? Tell us a little bit about your experience with diabetes and what led you into this sort of research. And Robbie, I'm sure you can probably dovetail together after Cyrus. I'd love to get a little bit of background on this so we can get a sense of the sort of depth of research you've done into this work.
Yeah, for sure. So I was actually diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was 22, which was a senior year in college. So I was going to Stanford University. I was just trying to graduate and move on with my life. And out of nowhere, I started to feel extremely thirsty and very lethargic. And I went through sort of like a whole, series of steps to get to a medical center where they finally figured out that I was living with type 1 diabetes. It took me to a hospital. 24 hours later, I was discharged from the hospital with a whole collection of medical devices, including a blood glucose meter, test strips, 2 different types of insulin, a carbohydrate counting guide. And I literally went from being a, happy-go-lucky 22-year-old to a chronic disease patient within 24 hours. And so my whole world was thrown upside down. At that same time, I actually got diagnosed with 2 other autoimmune conditions. The first one is alopecia areata, or alopecia universalis, which is why, as you can see, I have no hair, I have no eyebrows, I have no eyelashes, nothing. And then in addition to that, I also got diagnosed with hypothyroidism, Hashimoto's hypothyroidism. So I have Hashimoto's hypothyroidism plus alopecia plus type 1 diabetes, a triple whammy. And as you can imagine, at the age of 22, I was nervous. I thought that I had done something wrong, and that maybe the lifestyle I was living was actually causing all of these problems. So I got very interested in trying to understand how to make myself feel better, period, end of story. And when I was first discharged from the hospital, the doctors told me to eat a low carbohydrate diet because that's a sort of like common prescription for people living with all forms of diabetes. So I started to eat that way, and I tried to eat red meat, white meat, dairy products, fish, chicken, and I tried to limit my intake of fruits and potatoes and breads and cereals and pastas. Long story short, a year into this process, my energy levels had dipped even lower. My glucose was very hard to control. My insulin use was going up over the course of time. And I just knew instinctively that something was wrong. I still had a problem to fix, and I just didn't know what to do. So I started learning more, and I delved into the research of plant-based diets. And before I knew it, I changed my diet under the guidance of a medical professional. And so when I did that, my whole entire world changed in front of me within a week. And I started to eat a plant-based diet. My energy levels went through the roof. My glucose became more controllable, and my insulin use came down by 40% in 1 week.
Wow.
And it was really cool to feel that because, up until that point, it was sort of like a bleak outlook. But then as soon as I started to feel that, I knew that I was on the right path. So I put myself back to graduate school because I was so fascinated by this experiment that was happening inside of my body. Plus, I didn't know the science, and I really wanted to understand it. So I started reading everything under the sun, and before I knew it, I enrolled for a PhD program at UC Berkeley. So I went to UC Berkeley for another 5 years, and while I was there, I learned the ins and outs of nutritional biochemistry. And I did it with a focus on understanding what is diabetes, what is insulin resistance, and how do you either create it or reverse it using your food. And it was fascinating, absolutely fascinating, one of my favorite subjects in the world. And while I was there, I started to understand that there's a very strong connection between what you eat and not only your risk for diabetes, but also chronic disease. And after having read literally thousands and thousands of scientific papers and conducted experiments and written papers, it became very obvious to me from a very, very basic point of view that, eating a plant-strong diet or eating a diet that contains a significant number of plants and a proportion of plants is a phenomenal chronic disease reversing tool. And in fact, it's probably one of the strongest chronic disease reversing tools that the world has ever seen. And so Robbie and I joined forces 4 or 5 years ago to create Mastering Diabetes so we could bring this message to the diabetes world. And, over the course of the time, we've helped thousands of people change their lifestyle. And, we absolutely love what we do.
Amazing. I love it.
And
Wow.
James, my story is pretty similar. I'll get through it quick so we can talk about the really fun stuff. But I was just like Cyrus. I was thirsty all the time. I was going to the bathroom all the time. I'm like, what's going on? Something's wrong here. I told my mom, I said, Mom, I think I have diabetes just like Steve. So my older brother was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes 9 years prior to me. And so I knew the symptoms. And my mom said, no, don't be silly. You don't have diabetes. I said, okay. So she's going out of town and she calls to check in. And I said, Mom, I couldn't sleep last night. I was cramping the whole time. She said, okay, go upstairs, use your brother's blood glucose meter and test yourself. And I was well over 400. So you're not supposed to be above 140, 150. You're supposed to be somewhere between like 70 and 140. And that was right then and there. I said, my brother said, you have type 1 diabetes. So pack your bag. You're going to be in the hospital for a few nights. And that was the beginning. I remember my dad, he came back from the trip and just said, this is just an inconvenience. Don't worry, you can still live your life and all your dreams can come true. So my parents wanted to make sure we had the best medical care possible. They took my brother and I to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. I had an entire team, a nutritionist, a psychologist, an endocrinologist, and not a single person talked to me about the concept of reversing insulin resistance or focusing on insulin sensitivity so you can live a life that's going to reduce your risk of long-term complications. All they wanted to say was, you can be normal. You just have to inject insulin. You can eat foods similar to your friends. That was their mindset. And I think that's a missed opportunity to actually improve one's health. And now, Cyrus and I both believe that type 1 diabetes is a blessing and we are far healthier than we were before. And if we didn't get this diagnosis, we might not have made these lifestyle changes. And so I think our long-term health is going to be a heck of a lot better because of type 1 diabetes. I know that may sound weird to people, but we really do believe that. And the numbers kind of speak for themselves in some ways. But I tried many different diets over the years, and I learned from the same guru that Cyrus learned from. And now I follow the low-fat, plant-based, whole food diet. I'm eating well over 700 grams of carbohydrate per day, injecting a physiologically normal amount of insulin. So when you're living with insulin-dependent diabetes, whether that's type 1, type 1.5, type 2, your goal is to inject the same amount of insulin your pancreas would have normally secreted. Whatever amount your pancreas is not capable of secreting, you're just going to cover that. That's the goal. So in order to, eat such a large volume of carbohydrate energy and then use a normal amount of insulin, people are like, wow, what's going on? It doesn't even make sense. But we're going to obviously talk about that today.
Nice.
So my A1C is 5.3%. I don't use any other medications. I wear a continuous glucose monitor. So that gives me my blood glucose reading every 5 minutes. So every single meal, every single day, I see my graph of how does food impact my blood glucose levels. And I know how much insulin I'm injecting. So all of us type 1s, we're really just these test subjects all day, every day. What behaviors improve insulin sensitivity? What make you less insulin sensitive? And this approach is it's gotten amazing results. My time range is 90% for a person using multiple daily injections and not using a pump that's automated. That's an extraordinary number. So most people are in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And again, I get to eat, large volumes of food that I love. We teach people, we're here to give people this option. If you want to eat more plant-based foods, if you want to live a life where you get to enjoy potatoes, you get to enjoy fruit, you get to enjoy rice and pizzas and burritos, and you want to eat foods like that, you're living with any form of diabetes, we're here to show you how to do that, how you can do it healthfully, and the science that shows it's a great short-term decision and long-term decision.
Beautiful. Amazing. I mean, there's a lot to unpack in both your personal stories there. I think just a couple of things I want to highlight. One is that your illness and diagnosis for both of you was a blessing and a big sort of direction pointer to your purpose and calling. So I think that's amazing and something for a lot of people to really take on board listening to this, because a lot of the times we see illness or challenge in our life as the worst thing ever when we go into a victim state. So I love how you've taken control over that. Secondarily, both of you have now seen the complete and full power of food as medicine. I think that's just supreme and amazing and beautiful, and definitely our message here at Food Matters. Maybe Cyrus, this one is for you and the both of you as well, Robbie, probably to follow. It's like, what do you see as maybe some of the the biggest contributing factors to diabetes in the West? You know, is it food? What lifestyle sort of related issues are there that are contributing to diabetes? And why is it that so many people are suffering from this now? I mean, we see escalating rates, especially of type 2 diabetes, which is what they call it, the adult onset diabetes. Why is there such a proliferation of this disease in the West, in the US in particular? The numbers are staggering.
Okay, this is a great question. And I would say that there's probably 2, maybe 3 reasons why this is happening in my mind. Number 1, misinformation. There is a very large quantity of misleading information when it comes to understanding what diabetes truly is. And when I say this, I'm not trying to like point a finger at any one organization or any one, particular health expert. It's just as a whole, when you're diagnosed with diabetes, it's a very confusing condition. It's extremely confusing. And it's not because diabetes itself is an inherently, mystical process. The rules are relatively well described. If you understand nutrition, you understand science. It's just that in today's world, there's so many different groups of people who have so many different opinions about what diabetes is, and some of those opinions are evidence-based and some of those are not evidence-based. And so, the medical institution has sort of a couple of different stories that they tell, and then if you go to Instagram, you see from, other influencers their own personal experience. Then you go to YouTube, you see the same thing, but you go to Google, you see the same thing. So your average person living with diabetes, whether they're diagnosed with type 1, like Robbie and myself, pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes, gestational diabetes, they go to the internet because the internet is the unknowing source, all-knowing source of information. They get there, and within, a couple of hours, a couple of days, a couple of weeks before they know it, they're like, wow, this guy says this guy says this paper says this institution says this organization says this, my doctor says this. You know what? I'm confused. I don't really know what to do. And as a result of that, I think what it does is it breeds a little bit of apathy. And it's unfortunate because I do think that there's a lot of people who are very motivated to want to change their life and, really take control of their food and their overall lifestyle. But they see this conflict that exists. And as a result of that, they lose motivation to actually want to change. And even if they did want to change, they don't know what to do, right? So I think that's sort of first and foremost is the information sort of sources and like the story, I think, could use a little bit of unity. And that's part of what we're trying to do is really try and teach people that diabetes across all flavors, all types of diabetes is actually unified by one story. And that one story is called insulin resistance. And if you can really understand what it is, then you can understand how you can eat to reverse insulin resistance, and then diabetes can become either more controllable or disappear in the majority of all situations. The second thing that I find to be frustrating, or part of the cause of why people have unhealthy lifestyles, is because the American environment is not set up for success. Okay, and when I say that, I mean when you drive down the road and you go to a strip mall, the options that are available to you are options that actually increase your chronic disease risk. Many restaurants have very unhealthy choices on their menus. Fast food is unfortunately just a part of the American lifestyle. When you go to the grocery store, the bulk of the grocery store is dominated by packaged and processed and refined foods, right? If you want to eat a healthy diet, you have to work hard. You have to do something different than the mainstream. And I commend people for doing that, but the norm is to eat packaged, processed, refined foods that have a significant amount of saturated fat, to prioritize eating food for convenience at all times, to not move your body very frequently, And as a result of that, it's no wonder that conditions like diabetes, like heart disease, like cancer are not only just growing, but they're growing at exponential rates. And so, even when people really are motivated to want to change, it can feel like the world is against you. And I encourage people to not lose that motivation because the answers are there. You just have to know exactly where to look.
Beautiful. What's your take, Robbie? Like, what are the big contributing factors to, insulin resistance, or even just that broad spectrum of insulin resistance from diabetes to weight gain to all sorts of other chronic disease issues?
I would agree with everything Cyrus just said, and just emphasize that I think, you guys have the right name here. Food matters. Like, the food is the biggest problem here, as far as how far away we have gotten from doing the right thing. Like, we all know sleep's important. So most people, they sleep a little bit. Maybe they should sleep more. We all know exercise is important. Most people move a little bit. They at least walk. They do something. There's physical touch. There's human interaction. I mean, there's people get a little bit of sunshine. They drink some water. Like, they do the basics. But when it comes to food, just like Cyrus was saying, we are so far away, like just dramatically removed from what is a healthy diet. Like, it is just abysmal out there. And that is the biggest problem. And once you just make even small changes, just a little bit of progress with your food, you see dramatic results quite quickly.
Beautiful. And I mean, I agree on this environment pressure. I mean, I've lived in the US, I've lived in Europe, I've lived in the Middle East for a little bit of time, and I'm from Australia. And now I'm living on a tropical island in the Pacific Ocean. And here, especially when you go to the remote islands, you are living in a natural supermarket in that all of the food comes from a garden. And very little, if anything at all, is bought from a store. And in fact, many communities here, some of them don't use money. They just have trade of just local produce that's available. Now, that's at complete odds to the developed, advanced West, where we've packaged and productized everything. And America is particularly good at this. I was joking with a friend the other day. You guys take one product and or one ingredient, like let's just say CBD, and you productize that into a million things. It's in bottled water, it's in tongue sprays, it's in eye drop, you name it, So, I mean, America is very great at this, and there's a lot of amazing positive innovations that have come out of it. So it's a real double-edged sword, right? I mean, we're in a time of extremes, but the environment is a huge issue for many people. So I really, really do acknowledge that. So at the core of diabetes, and even I keep helicoptering out a little bit further because insulin resistance is at the core of diabetes, but managing blood sugar is an issue that most people have problems with, right? And that can result in just foggy memory, weight gain, not feeling supremely themselves, and it can result in a degradation of their overall health. And obviously insulin resistance is more of the diabetic outcome there. What is insulin resistance exactly? And how can people know if they are insulin resistant? Cyrus.
Okay, great question. So this is sort of the crux of the argument here, because insulin resistance can be pretty confusing, but I'm going to try and simplify it as much as possible. Okay, so if you go into the evidence-based literature and you try and understand how to create insulin resistance in either a human being or a laboratory rodent, because that's sort of preclinical data is done in laboratory rodents, and then human experiments are done in humans. So if you look into the research to try and understand, what can I feed a mammal and turn them into an insulin-resistant mammal, and then how can I study that? When I first started my my studies at UC Berkeley, I had that same question because I was supposed to create insulin resistance in animals and then rescue that insulin resistance using either nutrition or exercise or some combination of the both. And I first went into this thinking, oh, okay, well, I'm going to make them insulin resistant, therefore I'm going to feed them sugar, right? I'm going to feed them either glucose or sucrose or fructose or high fructose corn syrup, and that's going to create insulin resistance because diabetes and insulin resistance is all about sugar. But it turns out if you go into the research, what you find is that that's not the case. The way that insulin resistance is created in experimental animals and in humans is by feeding a high-fat diet, okay? And so I saw this over and over and over again, and it was very interesting to me because I was like, wait a minute, hold on. You're telling me that if I create insulin resistance in an animal, I can simply do that by feeding them a diet that's high, not only in total fat, but specifically saturated fat? That seems counterintuitive. How come people in the world of diabetes aren't talking about this?
Yeah.
And everybody, the story is that sugar equals diabetes, or sugar causes diabetes. So what happens is that when you eat a diet that contains a significant amount of fat, okay, fat in your diet, specifically saturated fat, travels down your esophagus, it goes into your stomach, it gets sort of partially unfolded, and then it goes into your small intestine. Inside of your small intestine, the fat molecule, the majority of all fat molecules that you consume are called triglycerides. So triglyceride is just a fancy way of describing a glycerol backbone attached to 3 fatty acid molecules. So you got 3 tri and then glyceride, so triglyceride. So as soon as that triglyceride gets inside of your small intestine, there are enzymes that are either secreted by your liver or by your pancreas that are designed to break apart that structure and liberate these 3 fatty acids from the glycerol backbone. These 3 fatty acids are then absorbed through the walls of your small intestine. They go into your lymph system and they end up inside of your blood. And inside of your blood, they're put into these little particles called chylomicrons. Okay, so people don't need to remember all of these big words. That's not going to be on the test. But these chylomicron particles have one mission, and that mission is to deliver fatty acids and cholesterol to tissues that need it. And so these chylomicrons are in circulation in your blood 24 hours of the day. So when these chylomicron particles end up picking up a bunch of cargo from your food, then they have to go deliver that cargo to tissues. And so if the chylomicron particles were able to deliver those fatty acids and cholesterol specifically to your adipose tissue or your fat tissue, and only there, which is technically speaking a safe place to keep fat, then diabetes wouldn't really be that big of a problem in our world today. Okay, diabetes would be a condition, but it would be about this important. Okay, the reason why diabetes has become such a big deal in today's world is because the higher fat content that you eat in your diet, the more fatty acids are delivered not only to your adipose tissue, but also to your liver and to your muscle. And this is where we have to start the conversation of insulin resistance, okay? So fatty acids are designed to go into your adipose tissue because that's an enzymatically and mechanically safe place to keep fatty acids for a long period of time. They go inside of your adipose tissue, they stay there for days, weeks, months, and then when your adipose tissue has to get rid of those fatty acids, it can then export those fatty acids and send them to other tissues so that they can be used for energy. But when these fatty acids end up going inside of your muscle and inside of your liver, it presents a little bit of a problem because it's a spillover that's not necessarily designed to go inside of those tissues in large quantities. Now, your muscle and liver are designed somewhat similarly in terms of their fatty acid storage capacity, and that they're designed to store small amounts of fat and utilize that fat as a temporary storage mechanism and then oxidize that fat when the time is right. But if you're eating a high-fat diet and you're constantly taking in more fat for breakfast and for lunch and for dinner, and then you do it again the next day and the next day and so on and so forth, it's very easy to overwhelm cells in your liver and cells in your muscle tissue with too much saturated fat. And as soon as that problem starts to happen, cells in both your liver and muscle have to create some kind of redundant mechanism to try and block that more fat from coming in and more glucose and more amino acids from coming in, because really what they're responding to is excess energy. So in an effort to try and say, okay, how do I slow down the rate of energy coming into this tissue? The easiest way to slow down the rate of entry of energy into a tissue is to block the master hormone known as insulin. Because insulin has 1,000 roles in your body or more. And the major role that insulin plays is it's called your primary, your master anabolic hormone. Anabolic basically means, a synthetic process or a building process. So when insulin is present, it's a high energy signal for tissues to replicate and to take up fuel from the blood. So if you can slow down or limit the effectiveness of insulin, then what you do is you slow down the rate at which fuel, fatty acids and glucose and amino acids get inside of tissues. So what your liver and muscle do as a self-protective mechanism is they say, you know what? I'm going to block insulin. I'm going to stop communicating with insulin, because if I do that, then I can limit the amount of stuff that comes inside of here and I can keep it inside the blood. So as a self-protective mechanism, they initiate insulin resistance or insulin rejection. And by doing that, now they, not as much, material is flowing inside, not as much fuel is coming inside of those two tissues. Here's the problem. As soon as that insulin resistance mechanism is initiated inside of your liver and muscle, it makes it very challenging for carbohydrate to be utilized as a fuel, okay? So if you're in that insulin resistant state because you've been eating a high-fat diet for days or weeks or months, and then you try and eat something that's carbohydrate rich, call it a banana, maybe a bowl of quinoa, right? Maybe a bowl of black beans, right? What happens is that those carbohydrate chains, which are made up of monosaccharide particles known as glucose, known as fructose, known as a whole bunch of other names, those particles get broken down into individual units. Now, the glucose wants to get inside of your liver and muscle where the fatty acids are already stored. And the glucose, in order to get inside of those liver and muscle cells, has to be accompanied by insulin. Or insulin is basically the one that's going to knock on the door and say, hey, knock, knock liver, knock, knock muscle. Do you want this glucose? There's some in the blood right now. Please take it up. And so because these two tissues have basically initiated their own version of insulin resistance, they say, no, insulin, I'm not interested right now. I got a bunch of stuff in here. I got to do something about this first. When I am done oxidizing these fuels, I will then allow you to give me more stuff. And so what insulin does is it knocks on the door, says, hey, I tried to knock, nothing's happening. And as a result of that, glucose cannot exit the blood as easily. So glucose ends up accumulating inside of the blood in higher and higher concentrations. So this is classic for people who are eating a high-fat diet, whether it's a ketogenic diet, a paleo diet, an Atkins diet, you name it. They'll eat that diet. Then they'll try and eat one piece of fruit, one potato, one bowl of quinoa. And 2 hours later, they'll check their blood glucose meter and they'll look at it and they'll say, 284.
Wow.
That's a high number. Okay, I get it. The potato is what caused a high blood glucose.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah, this is big. This is a really cool skin. This is a
glucose.
new way to see it. Wow, this is really big. This is a massive sort
happens.
of unveiling of nutritional conception here, because we are taught that, carbohydrates and sugar influence the blood sugar directly, but you're saying, no, it's sort of this fat. Well, there's a few things I want to unpack here. First of all, this really explains in a detailed way why people with stored adipose tissue that are obese or overweight have a higher propensity for diabetes, right? Because this explains it completely, perfectly. Then the second thing is, I think probably what I want to unpack here from a practical perspective going into this is like, first of all, not all fat is created equal. And the type of fat that many Americans are consuming in mass, many Western countries, I should never ever circle in on America completely, although it's a bit of an example. My son was born there, so I'm tied into that country and I love it as much as anybody else
Sure.
living there. But I wanted to say in the West, the types of fat that most people are consuming are really damaged, crazy, not good for you type fats. What are the big sort of offenders because you're saying here, whoa, fat is the key problem here, too much fat. But then I want to be careful here because fat is also amazing for regulating hormones, regulating
Bingo.
Satiation and hunger. Even out in the wilderness, hiking through remote islands here, people still go for fat. They crave fat because it's an ancient thing we're wired in for. We're wired in for fat and sugar. So fat can't be bad, but obviously there's certain types of fat that is bad. What are the biggest offenders here? I mean, Cyrus, Robbie, do you guys want to tackle this collectively or talk me through it?
For sure. Okay, so I promise I'll let Robbie talk here. I just love this question. So
we're in the presence of one of the world's greatest nutritional biochemists. Like,
Yeah,
these are his questions.
I'm feeling it.
Listen carefully.
Thank you, Robbie. Okay, so yes, you're right in the sense that there is, let's be very specific when we use words here, because oftentimes people say things like, oh, sugar causes diabetes, fat causes diabetes. And the truth is that neither one of those statements is correct. Okay. In the world of insulin resistance, we have to be very specific with our words. Okay. And the phrase that I like to use is I say, insulin resistance is caused by the accumulation of excess saturated fat in tissues that are not designed to store large quantities of fat. Okay. So I didn't say fat causes insulin resistance. I said it's excess saturated fat, and it's stored in tissues that are not mechanically and enzymatically designed to withstand that quantity of incoming fat.
Sure.
Okay. Now, to answer your question, there's multiple types of fat. All fat is not created equal by any stretch of the imagination. There's three main classes of fat. The first one is trans fat. The second one is saturated fat. The third one is unsaturated fat. Okay, trans fat does occur naturally in in animal-based foods. Okay, however, the majority of the trans fat that humans are consuming, or the Western world is consuming, does not come from animal products. It comes from partially hydrogenated oils, foods that have undergone a hydrogenation process. Okay, so imagine you're a food manufacturer and you see a bottle of oil sitting on the table, and you're like, okay, if there was some way where I could take that oil that's liquid and I could turn it into a solid, then I could turn it into a product that people could then use a knife with, and they could spread it on top of an English muffin, or they could spread it on top of a waffle, and it would be more shelf stable, and it would be more appetizing and more appealing to consumers.
And
So
people would
what
say,
food manufacturers did-
I can't believe it's not butter, right?
I can't believe it's not butter. There you go. That's exactly right. So what food manufacturers did as far back to the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, is they invented this thing called a hydrogenation process, which is literally nothing more than a chemical process that's a synthetic manufacturing method to take a liquid and turn it into a solid. And so in the process of turning a naturally occurring oil into a solid, you have to hydrogenate the oil. Now, the problem with hydrogenation is that it changes the sort of molecular formation of the resultant fatty acids. And as a result of doing that, when you introduce those partially hydrogenated or fully hydrogenated oils into your body, they end up causing all types of damage, especially to your cardiovascular system. So there's plenty of evidence that demonstrates that trans fats or partially hydrogenated fats increase your risk for atherosclerosis, the hardening of blood vessels. They can raise your LDL cholesterol, they can raise your blood pressure, and they can increase your risk for diabetes. Nobody wants any of that. Okay? Biggest contributors, trans fats. If there's any trans fats in your diet, be done with them. Get them out of your diet immediately.
Cyrus, where else will people find trans fats outside of just the margarine spreads or the fake sort of spreads? Like, they're also in other processed foods, or what are some other common offenders?
Yes. So I actually have an entire list. I'm going to pull that list up as we're talking.
Yeah, great.
Here.
Do it, because I really want people to know this, because people will be like, oh, that's great. Well, I'll just eliminate my margarine or my easy, never goes too hard spread, right? And then I'll be fine. But it's creeping into a myriad of places, right? I want people to really know this, where it is. So please pull it up. This is important information.
Yes, for sure. Here we go. Okay. We wrote this in our book called Mastering Diabetes, and you can find partially hydrogenated vegetable oils in all types of products, including, but not limited to, cakes, pies, cookies, biscuits, breakfast sandwiches, margarine, crackers, microwave popcorn, cream-filled candies, donuts, ready-to-use dough, and both dairy and non-dairy coffee creamers. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. Okay. So what happens is that they do the hydrogenation process to the oils, but then the oils are then put into all of the products that I just named. And as a result of that, when you go buy that product off the shelf, it says the word, partially hydrogenated canola oil, partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, and then before you know it, you're not taking on trans fats, and that was never your intention.
So this is you must be looking at this going, oh my God, this is so simple. We are consuming a Franken oil, and this Franken oil is basically causing insulin resistance, which is causing diabetes, and the whole world is not yet listening. I mean, hopefully they are starting to listen now, and courtesy of this. But this is big. This is really big, because, like you said, we're taught that it's like you're just eating too much carbs, too much sugar. Your fault. Your body's failed you. But you're saying no. The scientists have failed us. They're the ones that have failed us. The big food companies have failed us. Man, this is big. I love it. Great story.
Yeah, absolutely.
James, I'm glad you think it's big, because we think it's big too.
Yeah, it's huge. I've been in nutrition sort of research in my own way for a number of years. I mean, since I started doing the research for Food Matters in 2006, 2007. And, I've learned a lot of things, and I've gone on and they've been debunked too as I've gone along the way. So there's things you learn and then you have to unlearn. And I'm sure you've been through this, Cyrus and Robbie. Both of us have been. All of us have been. But there's certain points you get to a deep truth and a deep knowing and a deep understanding and a deep realization that there's no two ways to look at this. And oftentimes when you come to that realization, you follow it back to its source, and at some person or some conglomerate or some organization has done some form of manipulation to something which has created a downstream effect of issues. That's why we tend to question everything that's done from a processing point of view and be like, is this really taken with regards to the highest understanding of what we need as humans? So this is really huge.
Yeah.
So this is trans fat, right? So now let's talk about the other types of fat. So we're getting to saturated fat is one of the next ones. Let's talk about that.
Okay, cool. So saturated fat is, like I was talking about earlier, it's actually the biggest culprit for insulin resistance because saturated fat is very abundant in the Western diet. You can find saturated fat in mainly animal products, but you can also find it in plant products. So it's in red meat, white meat, dairy products. Cheese tends to be extremely high in saturated fat. It's also in vegetable oils. It's in coconut oil. It's in MCT oil, and it's also present in the plant-based world. You find it predominantly in foods like avocados, a little bit in nuts and seeds, in olives, as well as vegetable oils as well. So. The thing with saturated fat is that saturated fat is a safer version of fat than trans fat. There's no question about that.
Okay.
But again, what we're mainly concerned with here is the total quantity of saturated fat that's coming into your diet.
Yeah.
Does the chain length matter? Is it if it's a medium chain triglyceride versus a long chain triglyceride? Sure, that matters. But in the general scheme of things, before you even get to like the nuanced details of chain length, I want you to think about how much am I consuming, right? And the total quantity of saturated fat is one of the most influential aspects of your diet that can create insulin resistance inside of your body. And just for full clarity here, let me just take one step backwards. Insulin resistance is important because insulin resistance affects your risk for developing mainly prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, and gestational diabetes, okay? The more insulin resistant you become, the higher your risk for all three of those. Insulin resistance also affects type 1 diabetes and type 1.5 diabetes and makes your life harder to control, or it makes it harder to control your blood glucose. But here's the kicker. Even if you have nothing to do with diabetes and you don't care about your blood glucose and it's not part of your universe, when you become insulin resistant, you increase your overall chronic disease risk.
Sure.
You increase your risk for most chronic diseases, including things like fatty liver disease, chronic kidney disease, Alzheimer's disease, and what is now considered type 3 diabetes, and heart disease. So, the term insulin resistance is kind of like, it makes it sound like it's only related to diabetes, but in reality, it's sort of a central influential figure that touches almost every single chronic disease you can think of. And if you can just sort of eat to reverse that and get rid of insulin resistance in your body, then you lower your overall chronic disease risk, and you get a lot of bang for your buck. So that's why we really encourage people to try and eat this way. The last thing I'll say before I stop talking.
Can I just talk on saturated fat, and maybe you want to finish your last point off with regards to this? I think it's really interesting to think about it a little bit from an anthropological perspective as well, because as you go spend time with indigenous cultures, their relationship with fat is that they don't typically have access to that much that often. And if you think about the way that we often consume in the West now, is that we've got unlimited access to meat and animal products, and we tend to be consuming much, much higher amounts of that. Then we've got unlimited access to like nuts and seeds. Like I go collect nuts here. There's like a wild almond here called Navel, and they'll often eat them, the local people, and so will I. But to get a Navel out of this seed, you need you need to be quite proficient at using a big knife. You might call it a machete. We call it a bush knife here. And you've got to be proficient, and you've got to be skillful, masterful, and it's like an art form to get 5 or 6 of these nuts, right? And it's hard work. So we're now putting like 50 almonds into like a cake base, or like we're using a lot of nuts and seeds, like maybe more than we typically would. Then we're using like dollops and dollops of coconut oil. But in nature, if you go open coconuts, I mean, that's hard work. I mean, I open them to make fresh coconut milk here. and you got to rasp it. I mean, it's like the physical labor it takes. So we've the mechanization of like food, that's probably not even a word, has made fat so much more easy for us just to purchase and consume. So I
Yeah.
think the volume is a
Very
big
good
issue
point.
here, which is what you're bringing up. Then one thing I wanted to speak to though is that the quality of saturated fat is very different amongst different types of fat too. Like things like maybe a coconut oil or even a grass-fed animal product, very rarely consumed, is totally different to an over-consumed factory farm animal, right? Because we know about the omega-3, 6, 9 ratios and the inflammation thing. So I see there's many parts of the story happening here. So if you take a sick beef cow that's fed corn, wheat, and soy, genetically modified corn, wheat, and soy, then it's high in omega-9, low in omega-3. Not only is that saturated fat, too much of it, going to be bad for you, but the quality of that saturated fat is also really poor quality, causing inflammation and other systemic issues in the body. So we've got a volume issue of fat. Then we've got a quality issue. Do you really sort of subscribe to that idea too? And that if people have really, really, really good quality saturated fat as a small amount, it can be extraordinarily important as an overall diet. Do you agree with that, or are you more like no fat is good?
No, there's no question about that. There's no question. I mean, what I don't want people to do is misinterpret our story into saying, oh, Cyrus and Robbie told me that I can't eat any saturated fat and that's bad for me and I should avoid it at all costs. The truth is that you can't. Even if you tried, you couldn't avoid saturated fat. But another sort of aspect of like how to determine whether it's a better quality or lower quality is to what we find is that if you look in the research, you'll find that foods that come from the plant-based world tend to be much more micronutrient dense than foods that come from the animal world, right? So there's no question that like a grass-fed animal versus a factory-farmed animal is going to have a difference in sort of quality in terms of like not only their fat content but many other many other aspects of the nutritional makeup. If you're comparing a saturated fat-rich food that comes from the plant-based world versus a saturated fat-rich food that comes from the animal world, what you find is that the plant-based food has more micronutrients. Vitamins, minerals, fiber, water, antioxidants, and phytochemicals. So if you're going to eat saturated fat-rich anything, try and get it to come along with those micronutrients. And if you can do that, then you're getting a higher quality overall food, and it's going to give you more of a protective effect than if you were to have that saturated fat in isolation without those protective micronutrients.
Sure, that makes sense. Great. Before we go to the last type of fat, Robbie, what are some of your favorite sort of saturated fat sources that you include in your diet?
James, the fun part about the Mastering Diabetes method is you don't have to think about it. Okay? So I don't sit down and eat a meal and think, oh, this ingredient is going to give me the saturated fats that I need. It's really becomes a focus on which whole plant foods do you enjoy and simply eating them when you're hungry till you're satisfied. I mean, it really becomes that simple, and you eat a diverse number of plants. You're going to get different colors. You're going to get different food groups, and you just eat. So I don't even think about it.
Yeah, that's cool.
I don't even know.
Yeah. It's intuitive.
And an important part of and like Cyrus was saying, like we don't want people to get misinterpreted here. We're not saying a zero fat diet. All whole foods contain fats.
That's right.
And not just fats, essential fatty acids. When I eat bananas, when I eat lettuce, when I eat some raspberries, when I eat some arugula, like it doesn't matter. All whole foods contain essential fatty acids. So ALA, that's the essential fatty acid that you get on the omega-3 side, which then gets converted to EPA and DHA, is in all whole foods. And so you eat enough calories, most often you're going to get enough, but in our program, we put in an insurance policy. Simply consume a tablespoon of ground flax seeds or ground chia seeds, and you automatically meet your essential fatty acid requirements for the day. Right then and there, everything else is just a bonus. And then you're living a lifestyle where, again, you're just eating a variety of plant foods. And you are then automatically getting the correct omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. Okay? So 4 to 1 to 1 to 1 is where you want that to be. And then that is what helps your body do the conversion properly.
Totally.
So it's that people eat too many omega-6s that prevents them from being able to do the conversions. Whereas people are like, oh, let me just keep on eating more omega-3s and more omega-3s, when that's not really the problem. The problem is too many omega-6s. So again, you don't have to think about this. You just eat whole foods, and life is simple, and you get to focus on what you love.
Great. I love it. And I guess that's really practical too. And I think there's a gentleman, Daniel Vitalis, he's probably a little bit more on the wild food, maybe a little bit more heavy on the animal product side. But on the sort of plant-based side, in his perspective, he's saying the variety of types of plant-based foods we're consuming has narrowed to this very narrow band, and inside that, it means we're missing out on so many nutrients, macro, micronutrients. We're missing out on so many different types of plant chemicals, phytochemicals that are supportive of overall health. And his recommendation, it aligns perfectly with what you're saying. Don't just eat one type of nut, eat 20 or 30 different types of nuts. Don't eat one type of lettuce, expand that out. Don't go have just one type of greens every time, just chard. You want to be experimenting and adding so many different types, and ideally wild and heirloom and indigenously grown foods, like really broaden that spectrum of type of foods you're eating, and worry less about should I be eating this and not that, and more about, am I eating a wide diversity of natural foods that come directly from the environment and have been as little manipulated as possible by humans? So this is a really cool common thread. I love that despite the complexity of what Cyrus is talking about, we're landing the plane on this area of just like, hey, it's okay, just eat foods from nature and widen the spectrum. Okay, Cyrus, last type of fat. Let's go for it. We've done trans fat, and we've done saturated fat.
And saturated fat. Okay. So the last one is basically unsaturated fat. Now, unsaturated fat can be, we could literally do an entire episode on nothing but unsaturated fat because it can get very detailed, but let's keep it sort of high level and understandable. Okay. The reason why saturated fats are referred to as saturated fats because they are what are known as hydrocarbon chains. Okay. So think of a chain of carbon molecules that's usually somewhere from 16 to 18 to 20 to 22 molecules long. So carbon, 16 to 22 times. And then on the outside of that carbon chain is nothing but hydrogen molecules. So there's a bunch of available parking spaces, and hydrogen occupies every single one of those parking spaces. Okay. So when that structure is created, that's referred to as a saturated fatty acids because the hydrogens are saturating every single available parking space. Okay. So if you were to take that chain and you were to remove one of the hydrogens from that chain, what you could do is you could remove one of the hydrogens from the chain. You could then kink the chain and turn it into a bent molecule, and you would form a carbon-carbon double bond. As soon as you do that, now you've created an unsaturated fatty acid. And the unsaturated fatty acid has a slightly different structure. It's missing a hydrogen. And as a result of that, it now has a different biological function. Okay? You can also do that again at a different location, and you could kink it twice, and you could create what's known as a polyunsaturated fatty acid. Okay? So in the world of unsaturated fatty acids, you basically have two different types. You've got monounsaturated fatty acids, single carbon-carbon double bond. Then you have polyunsaturated, which has multiple carbon-carbon double bonds, right? Now, in the hierarchy of like things that are going to cause insulin resistance and make your life more challenging, again, trans fat's number one, saturated fat number two, and then unsaturated fat is number three. So it's lowest on the totem pole of things that actually matter in the fat-based world, right? Okay. And as a result of that, what we like to tell people is like, listen, I don't want you to be afraid of unsaturated fatty acids. They have a very important biological role. Unlike saturated fatty acids, which are used as primarily a fuel, okay? They're stored in your adipose tissue and used to be oxidized later. They're stored in your liver and oxidized later. They're stored in your muscle and oxidized later, okay? They're a fuel that can generate energy for a cell. Unsaturated fatty acids are not used as energy. They are signaling molecules. They play very specific roles inside of the cellular architecture. And they're mainly used as signaling molecules, or they sort of regulate the fluidity of a membrane, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? And as a result of that, that actually is a good thing because monounsaturated fatty acids and polyunsaturated fatty acids can actually help improve your insulin sensitivity, believe it or not. The things to take into account here are, number one, we don't recommend consuming very large quantities of unsaturated fatty acids because, again, the higher your total fat intake, the higher your risk for developing, complications of insulin resistance. However, if you were to take your diet that is saturated fat rich, and you were to start to transition it towards foods that have more unsaturated fatty acids in them, what you'll find is that your insulin sensitivity will likely go up, and that you will actually decrease your chronic disease risk. and there's plenty of research to demonstrate this. There's one study in particular that I found absolutely fascinating. It's actually a meta-analysis. It's a whole collection of metabolic studies that were done. There's over 395 studies that were put together into one meta-analysis. And they found that if you simply take 10% of the calories that you're consuming from saturated fat and you substitute them for unsaturated fat, literally 10%, you can drop your cholesterol by as much as 25 milligrams per deciliter, 25 points. That's a big deal. I'm talking about a very small change in the quality of the fat that you're consuming, and you can get a very large change in your cholesterol readout. Okay, so this stuff matters. It absolutely matters. And the last thing I'll say here is, in order to get more polyunsaturated fatty acids, eat more, eat less animal-based foods and eat more plant-based foods, such as avocados, nuts and seeds, coconuts, and olives. And if you were to do that, then now you're increasing your polyunsaturated and you're substituting them for the saturated ones.
Wow. So really, okay, so this is big. And ultimately, everything points back to eat foods from nature, mostly plants, right? But
yeah, exactly right.
All this crazy stuff you've been talking about, Cyrus, we could just say eat foods from nature, mostly plants, right? Don't overcomplicate it. But
that's exactly right.
I love it. But ultimately, you've got these three types of fats, and you're like, so you got the trans-saturated and unsaturated. Poly and mono, and you're saying like essentially you want to be as low to no as possible on the trans, which makes sense. That's like a human manipulated laboratory fast food type factory food idea. Saturated fats, less of, but and like this study said, in comparison, if you've got like even just 10% of your saturated fat is actually you substitute for unsaturated, it has this huge positive impact on you. So it's basically telling us low to no trans fat or no, lower saturated, a little bit more unsaturated. And you're saying mostly try to get that from whole food forms, because here's another thing, right? People say, oh, the Mediterranean diet's great, and they go start lashing everything with tons of olive oil. And really, I think as well, something to talk about here is this whole more like anthropological way of looking at food, which is like go spend time with indigenous cultures. They don't really go and process massive amounts of oil. This is more of a civilization type thing, right? And so the processing of foods into oil, like extracting even oil out of coconuts, extracting oil out of olives, extracting oil out of sesame, extracting oil out of, what are these crazy vegetable melange that you have in the US, canola and rapeseed and all these other things, right? That is not really something that we do as indigenous humans, right? And we have to remember that we are indigenous humans. We're just a little bit outside of our indigenous environment. And from a time frame perspective, it's quite recent. So what is your thought on the processing of these types of oils, and how do you sort of dance with those? They are processed. How do you dance with oils that have been essentially bottled, like even hemp seed avocado oil or whatever, and which ones are your favorites, and how do you regulate the volume of oil that you tend to consume? Cyrus, Robbie, maybe you're both going to have some answers on this.
For sure. My recommendation would be, or our sort of recommendation here at Mastering Diabetes is lower your overall oil intake. I don't care what kind of oil it came from, whether it's canola oil, olive oil, coconut oil, MCT oil, you name it, right? I want you to be consuming less oil over the course of time. And if you can eliminate it from your diet, I think you're going to do yourself a metabolic favor. Okay. And there's actually, truth be told, there's a lot of people who are going to listen to this, and there's a lot of people, other health experts who are going to put a finger at me, and they're going to say, Cyrus, you're not paying attention to the evidence. You don't know what you're talking about. This is absolutely blasphemous, right? There's no evidence to support the fact that oil is actually detrimental to your cardiovascular health or your diabetes health. I can tell you one thing for certain. We work primarily with people who have diabetes, all forms of diabetes. And when we teach people to limit their oil intake or eliminate their oil intake altogether, we see a profound number of metabolic changes. Okay, so that you can be doing a lot of things to your diet. You can be eating more plants. You could be trying to limit your intake of chicken and red meat, right? But if there's still oil in your diet, what we find is that people's A1C values tend to be elevated. Their fasting glucose tends to be elevated. Their post-meal glucose tends to be elevated. Their cholesterol tends to be elevated, and their blood pressure can sometimes be elevated. As soon as they start to get rid of the oils altogether, or like really limit their consumption, all of a sudden multiple biomarkers start to fall into place, and it does it relatively quickly within a few months. Lower A1C, lower fasting glucose, lower post-meal blood glucose, lower blood pressure, lower total cholesterol, lower LDL cholesterol, lower triglycerides. And we see this over and over and over again. So I can argue it from a scientific perspective. I can also argue it from an empirical perspective. But in truth, if you can, just like you said 1,000 times over, eat whole food, eat real food. Try not to eat the extract of a food. Try not to eat the oil that came out of that food. Try not to eat the powder that was made from the original food. Just eat the food.
Eat the olive.
It's a pretty simple concept.
Yeah. James, you know how you were talking earlier about a deep truth? And when Cyrus and I speak about this topic of, the question of, does consuming oil make you more insulin resistant? The very fact that we are both living with type 1 diabetes and have had the opportunity to work with countless other people living with insulin-dependent diabetes, again, whether that's type 1, type 1.5, or type 2, the immediate, clear impact on how much more insulin you need to inject and how much more challenging it is to control your blood glucose when you consume oil is simply undeniable. And it just is repeatable over and over and over and over again. And so the really easy conclusion, again, like you both just said, it's just better to eat the whole food. There's a lot of logic there. And there's definitely no evidence to show that consuming oil is better for your health. Consuming olive oil is better for your health than consuming olives.
Yeah, I guess the research is just that the Mediterranean diet is good for your health, and then they look at, well, what are they eating? Well, it's a lot of plants, some fish, and then they're eating olives and olive oil. But then really, you're saying there's no specific study saying if you eat more oils, you will be healthier. And that makes sense to me, and it does. And I think just pairing it back, again, me being this filter of more this anthropological viewpoint, the extraction of oil is a modern civilization idea. And we've used it to fuel, we're extracting it from fossilized dinosaurs as well. We're using it to fuel our expansion as well. So really, I think that this is a powerful point. And so also when you eat fat from a natural source, there is a natural set point that you tend to regulate. Like, there's only so many olives you can eat. There's only so much avocado you can eat. Whereas if you have the olive oil, it can be a little bit, you can get a lot more than you probably would naturally from that product. Same with coconut oil. If you have a coconut, or if you rasp an old coconut, there's so many different ways you can eat coconut. Most people, Cyrus, you probably know that, having spent time in Costa Rica, and I'm sure, Robbie, you're familiar with that from, there's so many different phases of a coconut, right? But there's a limit to how much you can eat. And when I was in a remote village in a remote jungle, and we hiked 2 hours into the wilderness to go plant a garden with a couple of locals there, and they would have a lunch, and it would be boiled green bananas, which they would peel. Then they would have the coconut, which was the sprouted coconut that had the 2 or 3 foot leaf coming out the top, and they open, and it's got the fairy floss ball in the middle, and they're eating that, and they're scraping the edge of it. There's a little bit of fat there, but you eat that and you have a little bit, you're like, whoa, okay, I'm full. You don't keep going. You know what I mean? There's a natural set point when you eat natural foods. You just can't eat more. And so your point, which is you're saying the science overlaps this, is that you tend to just, if you eat it from a whole food source, you're sort of naturally self-regulating that concept. Now, how do you speak to cultures then that maybe live in, these Arctic circles where they eat more animal products, they eat higher fat diets? We do know that there are cultures that do that, but maybe they don't really have many carbohydrates either, so they're not causing that problem. Is that a thing? Or how do you sort of tend to put some of those outliers into this discussion?
Yeah. Okay. So I had done a little bit of learning about this, because there's just a common argument in the paleo world. They say, well, Eskimos are a great example of somebody who, eats a very low carbohydrate diet, and they're, they live, they have very low rates of chronic disease. And the truth is that, from what I understand, Eskimos don't live very long. Their life expectancy is relatively short in comparison to the Western world. So that's sort of one thing to take into account. Another thing too is that when you're comparing the Western world, let's just say, versus a culture that comes from a very isolated geographic area that doesn't have a lot of intermingling and less genetic diversity, okay, you're really comparing apples to oranges, right? Because that culture, that particular population may have developed some type of physiological adaptation
Yes.
to improve their ability to metabolize the food that's present in that specific area. So, if Eskimos evolved to be perfect consumers of the food that's available to Eskimos, then that's applicable to them in that geographic part of the world. But if you can't say that because I live in California or because I live on a Pacific island, then I'm supposed to eat the diet of Eskimos, because it's not a relevant argument any longer.
No.
Right. So that's something to also take into account. Is there's physiological differences between people on different regions of this world that are going to change the way that those individuals are able to metabolize the food that they're in their geographical area.
So a couple of other things I want to just speak to on this, just in also my observation as well, in terms of animal products. Like if I look at an indigenous culture here that I've got access to pretty untouched, they will consume animal products, but it's like a feast and famine type thing. They're mostly plant-based, mostly vegetarian, and then they'll get a wild pig or they'll take a wild bird or something, and it's not very common. So they'll tend to eat more in a short period of time of that type of product and then revert back to just this mostly plant-based sort of style, and then they'll have another intake of that particular food product. So I think that's also a interesting observation, because we tend to eat animals on a breakfast, lunch, dinner type basis in the West now, and it's just this incessant overconsumption. I think that's something to think about when you go buy something. Is that, would have my family naturally slaughtered that animal and eaten it spread out over like no, really, you eat it and it's done. That's it. That's like the 6 month thing, or the big celebration, or whatever it might be. And I'm just talking from an indigenous culture perspective, how it tends to overlap with what you're saying, So that's interesting. Now we look at fruit. Let's center in on fruit a little bit here. People have in the nutrition world have definitely tripled down on like greens and vegetables are, God's or Mother Earth's panacea for all the world's problems, right? And if you eat lots of vegetables, you'll start to get better. And that's a generalized statement that we're all in agreement on here. Then when the fruits come in, it's like, well, no, like you don't want too many high sugar fruits. And of course, from a juicing perspective, I mean, juicing is it's a processed food too, really. And so I use juicing, but I only use juicing to juice and extract things that I know are not going to cause too many issues. Like I don't go juice like straight pineapple and oranges and high sugar fruits and just concentrate that without the fiber. I will tend to juice greens or herbs or things that I want to extract some more medicinal qualities out of, right? So fruit has a little bit of a bad rep in this space, and potentially also in the diabetes space. And you guys are bringing it back. You're saying like if we don't have so much fat in the diet, fruit becomes our friend again, and even things like carbohydrates become our friend. And this is something that I really want to end this conversation on here, because I really, there's some challenges around this. Because one more thing to just finish my question is that in this little microcosm of a climate we have here, or community we have here, we have indigenous people here that have existed for 4,000 or 5,000 years on an indigenous type diet that is practically what you were talking about: plants, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, seaweeds, herbs, etc. And that they have a little bit of animal product occasionally. Then they come into the city here and they eat bread because it was an ex-French colony. They have rice because it's a cheap stored carbohydrate. And they have sugary drinks and they get fat and they get diabetes. Now there's campaigns saying they're eating too much rice, they're drinking too much soda, they're also having bread. And these first of all, these people, and I guess for a lot of people around the world, we're not really biologically adapted to go and have that much in our diet. But and one of the sides of your conversation, you're saying high sugar fruit's okay, and even many of these carbohydrates are okay. Is it the carbohydrates that are causing these issues with people, indigenous people getting diabetes, or is it the fat and the carbohydrates together? That combination is the problem. And if you take out the fat, the carbohydrate becomes less of an issue. Is this, I'm starting to get it now. I'm like your student at the front row where everything's starting to land, right? So take out the fat issue, you have less of the carbohydrate issue, and then the fruit thing becomes a moot point. Can we just labor on this for a bit at the end here? And Robbie, I'd love to hear your thoughts on fruit and the practicalities of that as well. So Cyrus, jump in.
For sure. Okay, so I'll start it by saying this. if you remember absolutely nothing from this entire conversation, just literally tattoo this to the inside of your arm. Ready? Fat inhibits glucose uptake. 4 words. Fat inhibits glucose uptake. That's all I want you to remember, okay? So if you fundamentally understand that when there is fat present in your diet, again, we're talking about specifically saturated fat, but also excess quantities of saturated fat, then glucose uptake is impaired. Glucose can still leave your blood and get inside of tissues, just not as well, right? So to go to your point, James, you're saying if you take somebody who's an indigenous eater and then you introduce a bunch of Western foods to them, and then, you know, the question is, well, is it the rice and the bread and the sugary beverages that caused the diabetes, or is it the fat that they were consuming, the saturated fat, or is it both of them? And the answer is twofold. The answer is both.
Yeah.
We recommend eating, number one, whole carbohydrates, okay? Whole carbohydrate-rich foods. I want you eating fruits, starchy vegetables, legumes, and whole grains. That's where I want your carbohydrate sources to be.
Okay.
I do not recommend consuming refined carbohydrates from cookies, crackers, chips, pastas, sugar-sweetened beverages, sodas. Those are napalm. There's not a single health expert in the world who's going to tell you to eat more of those refined carbohydrate-rich foods, okay?
Okay. Yep.
So that's number one. But number two, if you want carbohydrate metabolism to work in your body in any way, shape, or form, and you want it to be an efficient process that utilizes insulin effectively, the best way to do that is to lower your fat intake. In other words, carbohydrates are metabolizable easily in a low-fat environment.
Got it. Yeah.
Carbohydrates are not easily metabolizable in a high-fat environment. They're opposed to each other, right? High fat equals low carbohydrate absorption. Low fat equals high carbohydrate absorption. If you can just remember that, then this whole game becomes much, much simpler to understand.
Wow. And you must be just like absolutely shocked at what we're doing, right? Because we've introduced trans fat, and then we've upped our carbohydrate intake and our and our sugar intake, and so it's like this double whammy. No wonder our bodies are so out of whack. Can we speak to different types of carbohydrates here, because there's good and bad, right? And then we can get a little bit more into the fruit, like a white fluffy croissant made with like semi-dwarf wheat, you know, is not really an ideal food compared to like a quinoa or a millet or a buckwheat or something like that. Can you speak to that as those differences, and practically what are some good options for carbohydrates? Or even like fruits have carbohydrates, you know, sweet potato as well. So speak to me about that a little bit, and then we can jump more into the fruit discussion as well. But I love how you framed your answer just
For
then.
sure. Okay, cool. So I think the simplest way to think about it is that there are 4 classes of foods which contain whole carbohydrates, and then there's everything else. Okay. So the 4 classes of foods, again: fruits of any shape, color, and size. Starchy vegetables. These are vegetables that grow in the ground, like sweet potatoes, yams, squashes. I'm even going to throw corn into this category, even though corn is technically not a starchy vegetable. Okay. And then the third thing is legumes, which is going to be beans, peas, and lentils. And then the fourth one is whole grains. Whole grains like quinoa, like oat groats, like millet and sorghum and
Buckwheat.
farro. Okay. Buckwheat, perfect. Okay, so if it comes from one of those 4 categories, then those are whole carbohydrates, and you can eat those in abundance.
Okay, your body knows what to do with it, basically, in a low-fat environment.
Your body knows exactly right. Your liver knows how to handle them. Your pancreas knows how to handle them. Your muscle knows how to handle them. Your brain knows how to handle them in a low-fat environment. You hit it on the head, James. Okay, if it's anything else, okay. If it's anything else that is, you know, a cookie, a cracker, a chip, a pasta, a soda, a waffle, a croissant, you name it, okay? Those are refined by nature. You don't walk through a forest and find a croissant sitting on the ground, okay?
No.
You don't walk through a forest and see a waffle sitting on the ground, right? They're products of a manufacturing process. So if something had to be manufactured to turn it into an edible product, then exercise caution. But if you can eat the food in a unprocessed or minimally processed state, then that's going to be a better option for you to eat in abundance.
Got it. Wow. I mean, we really screwed it up, didn't we, humans? As soon as we touched food, we've just abused it.
Now you see why people are so complicated. They're so confused. It's just too complicated.
I know. What about rice? I mean, people point the finger at rice. White rice, brown rice. What's good? What's bad? Or okay? And I think one thing you said, in a low-fat environment, these things are okay. But I think we should just say, in a normal sort of fat intake environment, because you're not really. I don't know. I'm listening through the conversation here. I don't really think you're promoting a low-fat diet. You're just promoting a diet where fat comes naturally from the foods that you're eating, and you're saying we should be eating mostly plants, which makes sense. So if you're eating mostly plants and you're getting fats from those plants, and you're eating a small amount of animal products, if you do that occasionally, if someone does that, and you make sure they're high quality, then you're going to be in that sort of lower ranking of fat, overall fat consumption, right? So it's not really...
Bingo.
I want to be careful to say low-fat diet, because then people go to like low-fat products, which is a mess. We did that in the 80s. It was an absolute mess. And we went to crackers and biscuits and all these low-fat, and that was where we had huge issues. So, okay,
Correct.
So that's that. But rice, brown rice, white rice, black rice, red rice, where's it at?
Okay. So I'm glad you asked this question, because as I was just explaining the answer to the last question, I was like, oh, we didn't talk about rice. Rice is I'm going to put that into the whole grain category. Okay. Rice is a phenomenal food. Okay. So yeah, there's many different colors of rice. There's white, there's brown, there's black, there's red, there's green, there's any color that you can possibly think of. Rice is a phenomenal food. And it is definitely something that we recommend consuming. A lot of people are scared of eating rice, especially white rice, right? Mm-hmm. And I understand that, it's easy to point a finger at rice and say, oh, rice is the problem, don't eat it because it causes diabetes. But if we travel all the way backwards in time to the 1950s, there's actually research done by a professor named Dr. Walter Kempner at Duke University. And he actually invented a diet called the rice fruit diet. He fed people white rice, fruit juice, and white table sugar. 4 foods, that's it. He took everything else out of their diet. And he was able to, by feeding people these 4 foods, he was able to, number 1, reverse malignant hypertension, which was never done up to that point. Number 2, reverse type 2 diabetes. Number 3, reverse fatty liver disease. And dramatically improve and lower blood pressure as well, like dramatically lower blood pressure and cholesterol. So that's just one piece of evidence to demonstrate that white rice is not the villain that most people point it out to be. And, especially in comparison to, consuming croissants and cookies and crackers and chips and pastas and sodas.
Yeah.
If you're going to eat rice, I recommend eating a colored version of rice. But if you're going to eat white rice, don't stress over it. Just make it a minority of the food you're eating and eat the rest of those carbohydrate-rich foods, and you'll be fine.
And don't be having liters of oil or lots of trans fat in your diet, and that will slow down the way that the blood sugar is regulated in your body. Okay.
That's exactly right.
Wow. Robbie, speak to me about fruit a little bit. I know that you're a big fruit fan. I am too. I love fruit. I do good on it. And I know that for a lot of people, especially people that I've sort of worked with or spoken to a lot about nutrition, they feel when they eat fruit, they might get lightheaded or dizzy or too, like if I have just fruit in the morning, they don't feel very grounded, and maybe they try to put fat and fruit together in a smoothie to try slow down the uptake of the sugar. You hear these types of things, or food combining, and I'm getting the whole thread in the theory here. If you're getting a relative amount of good quality fats from natural whole food sources, plant-based food sources, and maybe small amounts of animal products, you guys are definitely more on the way more plant-based approach, which is fantastic, and I agree, then you're going to have less of an issue processing and handling fruit. Is that your theory? And then how do you speak to people that feel like they're lightheaded or they feel dizzy or they're going through a sugar high? Like women sometimes don't do so well on intermittent fasting or just eating fruit or only in the morning. Is there something that you've experienced around this or have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so you said earlier that we're bringing fruit back, and we're definitely bringing fruit back, James. It's something we're really passionate about here at Mastering Diabetes. And again, a lot of it just comes from the research and our experience living with it and working with clients, because we see on these continuous glucose monitors, everybody's saying fruit's going to cause a blood glucose spike. Fruit will cause an insulin spike. And just going back to that deep truth, when you see it in your own body and other people over and over and over again, they eat more whole fruit as they reduce their total fat intake, and all of a sudden the amount of insulin they need to eat that fruit drops while their total carbohydrate intake increases. And you see that over and over and over again. That deep truth continues to get reinforced.
Yeah.
But the idea of eating more fruit in your diet to improve blood glucose control and reduce your risk of developing type 2 diabetes or prediabetes or reversing it, you can look at it from just a logical perspective, and you can also look at the research. So from a logical perspective, you can ask yourself, have you ever met a person that developed type 2 diabetes because they were eating too much fruit? Like, do you have that colleague that comes to your office, they're drinking a smoothie in the morning, their lunch is a big bowl of papaya and some apples, and before the office, they eat, before they leave the office, they're eating some bananas and some blueberries or something, and that person developed type 2 diabetes? Have you ever met that person?
No, you're right.
It's just funny. It's just funny when you think about it.
Yeah, that's true.
And it just goes back into what you've been saying. Like, you're seeing the thread here. People who experience a problem consuming fruit, whether it's the lightheadedness you were talking about, or maybe they're feeling brain fog, or maybe they're even having blood glucose challenges, in almost every case, it comes back to the foods they ate prior. Everything Cyrus was explaining throughout this presentation. It's because they have put their body in a state of insulin resistance. They are living with insulin resistance. They are struggling to metabolize glucose. And it's really that simple. And as soon as you become aware of that, you start reducing this fats, all of a sudden you can get to enjoy fruit. And when you look at the research, over and over and over again, fruit consumption is linked to improved health. I mean, there was a meta-analysis that included 9 prospective studies, over 400,000 participants, including 27,940 with type 2 diabetes. And they looked at the association between fruit and type 2 diabetes and found that individuals who ate the largest amount of fruit had a reduced risk of type 2 diabetes compared to those who had the least amount of fruit in their diet. And then there's some small-scale studies where they actually fed people ridiculous quantities of fruit. So there was actually a study where they ate almost like 8 cans worth of fructose. 8 cans worth of fructose coming from fruit. And across the board, their cholesterol dropped, their blood glucose levels dropped, their LDL cholesterol dropped. So whether we're looking at small-scale studies or meta-analyses, you will consistently find fruit is actually associated with a reduced risk of diabetes, better blood glucose management, lower cholesterol, lower triglycerides, and this is whole fruit. Okay, and there's a lot of confusion around fructose. Oh, because fruit is high in fructose. And you look at the research that people are citing to say, oh yeah, fructose is this big problem. It's research looking at processed fructose. They're not looking at people who are consuming fructose from bananas and mangoes and papayas. So again, the whole thread here is whole foods in a appropriate fat environment, and you get to enjoy fruit without any problems.
Love it. Beautiful, amazing. Whole foods in an appropriate fat environment. And like if it's come from nature, eat it. If it's been somehow tinkered with by a man in a white coat, don't touch it. And this is this is huge. This is big, and it's so big and so ridiculously simple. I mean, Cyrus, sometimes do you think that in all of this work that you've done, it's maybe all just sitting there under our eyes. It's like the more you do, the deeper you go in the research, the more it takes you back to just like, oh, man in a jungle eating food. You know what I mean? It's like that in that way. Yes. It's quite fascinating, isn't it? And beautiful and like humbling.
It really is. In a way, it's like frustrating, but it's also like so simplistic that it's beautiful. I mean, I went through like a very long, education process and spent a bunch of money and, have a bunch of student loans still paying off. And at the end of the day, people are like, what do you do? And I'm like, oh, I got a graduate degree to tell people to eat fruits and vegetables.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really what I do, right? And it's just that simple because, the more simple you can make your diet, the better health you are likely to have. Period. End of story. It's just that simple.
Wow. Guys, this has been a supremely illuminating conversation. I'm so happy, Robbie, that we've stayed in touch over the years and been able to like keep connecting, and it's led to this discussion and for me to connect with Cyrus, yourself in this way as well. I feel that this is a movement that's returning us to our roots, and I'm so grateful that you guys are championing this cause out there. And I'm so proud. You must be proud of yourselves for the work that you've done with mastering diabetes. And I hope that our community and collectively our communities together can be the change, improve their lives and their health through this information, and then help take this message to more people so that we can recolonize ourselves on human as humans on this earth. You know, we've done a pretty average job, and we can turn it around. And illness is the gateway. Illness is the opportunity, and you guys have seen it as that, and you're living examples of that. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Cyrus. Thank you, Robbie. And make sure to check out Mastering Diabetes if you want more information, or check out their book. And can't wait to have you guys on again. I'm sure we can deep dive in more ways than one. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, James. You're such a wealth of knowledge, and you're doing such a good job of spreading the word about eating real food, and I really, really, really appreciate it. So, I'm honored to be here, and we, appreciate the invitation to be part of the summit, and would definitely like to collaborate in the future and continue to spread the word, no question.
James, I just have to say, we've known each other a long time, and I really respect and appreciate and am inspired by your consistency of continuing to serve and provide this information that's changing people's lives day after day. So thank you, and keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you, gentlemen. Have an awesome day. Ciao.